Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading somewhere most travel channels can't even get a visa for. North Korea, officially the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a country roughly the size of the American state of Mississippi that somehow manages to be one of the most talked about, least visited, and least understood places on the entire planet. Here's the detail that hooked me before we'd even gotten to a single king, war, or missile test. Down along the southern edge of this country runs a scar of land barely a couple of miles wide, seeded with more landmines per square foot than almost anywhere else on Earth, watched around the clock by two of the most heavily armed militaries in the world. And that scar, that supposedly dead strip of dirt, has quietly become one of the richest wildlife sanctuaries left in Asia. Cranes that are vanishing everywhere else on the continent. Bears. Deer nobody sees anymore outside of it. All of it thriving inside a minefield. Because for once, humans were too scared to show up. Hang on to that irony, because it's basically the whole country in miniature. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let your mind wander a little. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. We genuinely love reading those. Tonight we're starting at the very bottom of everything, the land itself, the mountains, the rivers, the cold. Because before there was ever a Kim family, or a Korean war, or a Hermit Kingdom, there was just rock, ice, and a peninsula that decided very early on it wasn't going to make anything easy for anybody. Chapter 1. The Mountains That Made a Hermit Kingdom. Picture the northern half of the Korean peninsula as a blanket somebody balled up and threw across the floor. That's not a metaphor. That's basically the topography. Something like 80% of North Korea is mountains or highland, which makes it one of the most rugged countries on the planet, right up there with places like Nepal or Bhutan, except with considerably worse Wi-Fi. Every single peak on the peninsula higher than about 6,500 feet sits inside North Korea's borders. The south got the beaches, the north got the cliffs. If you were designing a country from scratch and your goal was maximum inconvenience for anyone trying to farm, build a road, or invade, you would draw something very close to this. Flat, usable ground is basically a rumour here. Even the river valleys tend to arrive pinched between ridgelines, like the landscape begrudgingly allows just enough room for a village and a rice paddy before the slope reasserts itself. Farmers here have spent centuries terracing hillsides just to squeeze a harvest out of a country that would clearly rather be left alone. And yet people did settle it, stubbornly, for thousands of years, which tells you something about human persistence, or possibly human stubbornness, depending on your mood tonight. Running down the spine of the whole peninsula is a mountain chain the Koreans call the Baekdudaegan. And it's less a mountain range in the tidy, single ridge sense and more a tangled backbone of interlocking systems, the Hamgyong range hugging the northeast coast, the Rangnim range cutting the country roughly in half. Locals have long treated this spine as something closer to sacred geography than dead rock, the idea being that a single unbroken current of energy runs the length of it from north to south. Whether or not you buy the metaphysics, the practical effect is the same either way. This terrain does not care about your travel plans. And at the very top of that spine sits the mountain that matters more than any other in Korean identity, north or south, Mount Paektu, a stratovolcano straddling the border with China, climbing to just short of 9,000 feet. It is, by a comfortable margin, the tallest thing on the peninsula, and it's been extinct since around 1702, which sounds reassuring until you learn what it did before that. Somewhere around the year 946, Paektu erupted in what volcanologists now rank among the most violent eruptions anywhere on Earth in the last 5,000 years. Ash from that single event has been traced as far as northern Japan. Researchers now just call it the Millennium Eruption, because giving it a catchy nickname was apparently easier than describing what actually happened, which was, in essence, a mountain trying to turn itself inside out. And here's the detail that should keep you up at night if you weren't already trying to fall asleep. Paektu isn't dead. It's dormant. Scientists monitoring it in the past couple of decades have picked up small earthquakes and shifting ground, the geological equivalent of someone rolling over in their sleep. Nobody thinks it's imminent. Nobody's entirely ruling it out either. What's left at the summit today is Heaven Lake, a crater lake filling the old caldera, and it is genuinely one of the more striking things on the planet. Sitting at an altitude most passenger jets would consider respectable, with a shoreline that stretches for something like 15 miles around, and water that plunges roughly 700 feet down in places. It's frozen solid more than half the year. Both Koreas, separately and often bitterly, claim this lake as sacred ground, tied to the old founding myth of a bear-turned-woman and a sky god's son named Dangun, who supposedly founded the very first Korean kingdom nearby. It is, in other words, a shared national holy site that two nations pointing artillery at each other still can't fully agree on how to share. The North Korean state took that reverence and did something with it that is, frankly, a little audacious even by the standards of 20th century personality cults. Official history there claims Kim Jong-il, the country's second leader, was born in a secret guerrilla camp on the slopes of Paektu, the birth supposedly heralded by a double rainbow and the appearance of a new star in the sky. Historical records, the kind kept by people who weren't employed by the regime, place the actual birth in a Soviet military camp in Siberia, where his father was in exile. So somewhere between the propaganda and the paperwork, a maternity ward in the Russian Far East got quietly swapped out for a mythic volcano. Say what you want about the regime's economic planning, but their branding department has never once phoned it in. Come down off the sacred volcano and head south into the interior, and you land on the Kama Plateau, a highland tableland so large and so consistently elevated that Koreans have nicknamed it the Roof of Korea. It covers something like 40,000 square kilometres, roughly the size of Switzerland, sitting at elevations that generally run between 2,000 and 6,500 feet. It is also, without much competition, the coldest inhabited stretch of the entire Korean peninsula. Winter temperatures here can bottom out around -40 degrees, which happens to be the one single point on the thermometer where Celsius and Fahrenheit finally agree on something, having spent the rest of the scale arguing. Locals have called this region Korea's own Siberia for centuries, and when your own countrymen compare your hometown to Siberia, that's not exactly a tourism board slogan. The plateau is blanketed in dense coniferous forest, the kind of dark taiga you'd expect 2,000 miles further north, home historically to wolves and, in smaller and smaller numbers over the centuries, Siberian tigers padding through the same silent pine stands. Villages up here are sparse and scattered, separated by enough wilderness that for most of Korean history this was less a place people lived and more a place people occasionally disappeared into. This is the part where the terrain stops being scenery and starts being destiny, because that brutal, mountainous northeast was, for most of Korean history, the last place anybody wanted to settle. Population and agriculture instead pooled into the narrow western lowlands, along river valleys like the one carrying the Taedong past what's now Pyongyang, where the land finally softens enough to plant something. Barely 1/5 of North Korea's total land is considered arable. Everyone else got squeezed onto that sliver of usable ground like commuters onto a single subway platform, while the mountainous majority of the country sat there being dramatic and mostly empty. The coastlines don't split the difference either. Get out onto the eastern shore, facing the Sea of Japan, and you'll find water that goes deep fast. A coast so steep it barely bothers with a proper continental shelf, and very few natural harbours worth the name. Swing around to the west coast on the Yellow Sea side, and it's almost the opposite problem. Wide, muddy tidal flats and one of the largest tidal ranges anywhere on the planet, water levels swinging by dozens of feet between high and low tide in some spots. Boats here don't just dock, they negotiate. It's the kind of coastline that makes you appreciate the person who invented the tide table. Now, water doesn't just sit around North Korea, it also defines where the country legally stops existing. The Yalu River is born high on Paektu's slopes and runs close to 800 kilometers, roughly the distance from New York to Chicago, down to the Yellow Sea, carving almost the entire western half of the border with China as it goes. Along the way, it splits around something like 200 islands, the vast majority sitting on the North Korean side. For decades, the river also powered one of the largest hydroelectric dams built anywhere in East Asia under Japanese colonial rule. A genuinely staggering feat of engineering for its time, sitting on a river that today is best known for something considerably less flattering. In deep winter, the Yalu freezes hard enough to walk across, and it has become, quite literally, one of the main routes desperate North Koreans use to defect into China. The same river that was drawn as a wall, turns out, a few months a year, to have a door. East of Paektu, the Tumen River picks up the job, tracing the rest of the border with China before it brushes up against a short stretch of Russian territory and empties into the sea. It's a smaller, scrappier river than the Yalu, but it does the same double duty, official boundary for most of the year, escape route once the ice sets in. Between the two rivers, the country is bordered on almost every side by either water it can't easily cross or mountains it doesn't want to. Geography here didn't just describe the isolation, it built the walls first and let the politics move in afterward. And it's worth sitting with that for a second, because the nickname Hermit Kingdom gets thrown around today like it was invented for Kim Jong-un's border policy. It wasn't. Foreign traders and diplomats were slapping that label on Korea back in the 1800s, long before any Kim was born, back when the ruling Joseon dynasty had spent generations deliberately sealing the peninsula off from foreign ships, foreign missionaries, and foreign ideas. The terrain simply made that decision easy to enforce. When your western border is a pair of half-frozen rivers and your interior is wall-to-wall cliffs, you don't need much of a navy or a standing army to keep the outside world at arm's length. The mountains were doing the isolating for free, centuries before anybody in Pyongyang thought to take credit for it. Sitting on top of all that unwelcoming terrain is a genuinely absurd amount of buried wealth. Geologists estimate North Korea is sitting on somewhere between $6 and $10 trillion in mineral deposits. More than 200 different types, including coal, iron ore, magnesite, graphite, gold, zinc, and copper in staggering quantities. One single deposit near the town of Jong-il is thought to hold more rare earth oxide, the stuff inside your phone, your electric car, and roughly every piece of modern military hardware than the entire rest of the planet's confirmed reserves combined. It is, on paper, one of the richest patches of ground on Earth. And thanks to decades of sanctions, crumbling infrastructure, and a government that treats outside investment the way most people treat a chain email, almost none of it gets dug up. It's a treasure chest the owner can't afford to open. Then there's the climate sitting on top of all of it, which seems designed to punish whatever the terrain didn't already ruin. Winters arrive on cold, dry winds barreling down from Siberia, the same weather system that makes the Kaima Plateau such a nightmare. Summers flip the script entirely, turning hot, sticky, and monsoonal as moist air rolls in off the Pacific, dumping most of the year's rainfall into July and August alone, occasionally with a typhoon-riding shotgun. When the rains are gentle, they're barely enough. When they're not, the same steep mountain terrain that funnels water into narrow farmable valleys turns those valleys into flash flood corridors, washing out crops the country can't spare in a single bad week. Extremes at both ends of the calendar, with very little pleasant middle ground. You'll want to remember that particular detail. It comes up again, more than once, later in this story. And then, finally, back to that scar we opened with. After the fighting between North and South ground to a halt in 1953, both sides carved out a buffer roughly 250 kilometres long and only about 4 kilometres wide, mined it, fenced it, and armed it more heavily than almost any other stretch of border on the planet. Nobody was supposed to go in. For over 70 years now, almost nobody has. And in the total absence of farmers, developers, hunters, and hikers, something nobody planned for happened. The place turned wild. More than 5,000 species now call the demilitarized zone home, over 100 of them officially endangered or protected. Red-crowned and white-naped cranes wintering in wetlands that have vanished almost everywhere else in East Asia. Asiatic black bears, musk deer, and the shy, goat-like Amur goral picking their way along cliffs that no human has disturbed in living memory. The most dangerous, mine-riddled strip of land on the entire Korean peninsula accidentally became its most successful nature reserve, purely because the one thing standing guard over the wildlife turned out to be human fear itself. That's the stage. A cold, cracked, mineral-rich peninsula, walled in by its own mountains and rivers, split down the middle by a border so lethal that nature simply moved in and made itself at home. It's a landscape that seems almost built to isolate whoever lives on it, long before any king, dynasty, or dictator ever got the idea to do the isolating on purpose. Which raises an obvious question for the people who eventually did show up here. Thousands of years before anyone had heard the words Goryeo, Joseon, or Hermit Kingdom, who looks at land this unforgiving and decides, yes, this is where we're building a civilization. Chapter 2. The Bear, the Kingdom, and a Million Angry Soldiers. So here's who looked at the Kaima Plateau, the Yalu, and a mountain that occasionally reboots the regional ecosystem, and decided this was home. According to legend, nobody looked at it and decided anything themselves. The decision was made for them, by a god, roughly 4,000 years ago. The story starts with Hwanin, the Lord of Heaven, whose son Hwanung got bored of paradise and asked, repeatedly, if he could go run a kingdom on earth instead. Eventually his father said, fine, take 3,000 followers and figure it out. And Hwanung descended to a mountain peak the old text called Taibek, which later tradition quietly points at, of all places, Mount Paektu. So even the myths can't resist a callback. Hwanung set up shop on the mountain and almost immediately got a visit from a bear and a tiger, both of whom wanted the same thing, to become human. Reasonable request. Hwanung's solution was not reasonable. He handed them a bundle of garlic and mugwort and told them to eat nothing else while sitting in a cave, out of sunlight, for 100 days. The tiger lasted about 20 minutes, metaphorically speaking, and stormed off. The bear stuck it out, emerged as a woman named Ungnyo, and because ancient myths rarely bother with a courtship phase, married Hwanung almost immediately. Their son was Dangun Wangyom, and if your own family reunion stories feel a little far-fetched, you now have some perspective. Dangun, so the legend goes, founded a kingdom called Gojoseon in the year 2333 BCE, ruled it for around 1500 years, then retired and became a mountain spirit, a better pension plan than most of us are getting. Here's the catch. Nobody wrote any of this down until the 1200 CE in a history compiled by a Buddhist monk. Call it 3,000 years after the fact, which is a bit like reconstructing the founding of Rome from a text written last Tuesday. That doesn't make it worthless. Foundation myths are rarely about literal accuracy. They're about a people deciding, later, what story they want to tell about where they came from. And the story Korea chose involves heaven, a bear, and a mountain that's still there. Strip away the divine paperwork and the archaeology backs up something real. Gojoseon existed, and it existed early. It controlled territory across the northern peninsula and down into Manchuria, ran a genuinely advanced bronze and later iron culture, and left behind so many dolmens, those massive stone burial monuments, that the Korean peninsula still has more of them than anywhere else on the planet. Gojoseon wasn't some backwater waiting for civilization to arrive. It was trading, fighting, and building monuments while much of the neighborhood was still figuring out agriculture. I know, dolmen counts and bronze alloys aren't exactly thrilling material, but stick with it, because the sheer wealth flowing through this stretch of coastline is exactly what's about to get Gojoseon in trouble. Being an early, wealthy kingdom sitting right next to an enormous and increasingly organized neighbor has a downside, and that downside's name was Han China. By 194 BCE, Gojoseon's throne had actually been seized by a man named Wee Man, a refugee general fleeing a failed rebellion in a Han vassal state. He crossed the border, made himself useful, and then, in a move that should surprise nobody who has ever watched a workplace drama unfold quietly, took over the whole operation. His new dynasty, Joseon, figured out something clever. Geography had made them the toll booth. Every trade route and diplomatic contact between Han China and the peoples of the peninsula had to pass through their territory, and they intended to charge for the privilege. For a while, that was a brilliant business model. Then Wai Man's grandson, King Ugeo, got greedy about it. Ugeo didn't just tax the traffic passing through. He started blocking it outright, cutting off Han China's direct contact with tribes further south and east. Picture a toll booth operator who decides he'd also like to open all your mail. Emperor Wu of Han, not a man famous for his patience, sent an envoy to suggest, politely, that Ugeo knock it off. The meeting went badly. The envoy ended up dead on the way home, and Emperor Wu, who by this point controlled one of the most powerful empires on the planet, decided a strongly worded letter was no longer sufficient. In 109 BCE, he sent an army instead. This is generally how these stories go. Everything's fine, everything's profitable, and then somebody reads somebody else's mail. The Han assault came by land and sea, 50,000 troops marching in, a 7,000-strong naval force sailing up the coast, and Wangyeomsong, Gojoseon's fortified capital, held out for the better part of a year. Then it fell apart from the inside, the way sieges usually finish what armies start. Ugeo was assassinated by one of his own ministers. That minister's faction fought on for a while. He got assassinated too. Eventually, in 108 BCE, the exhausted remnants of the government surrendered, and the first Korean kingdom anyone can reliably date came to an end. Not conquered outright, so much as it dissolved from within, while a very large army waited patiently outside the walls. Han China didn't just walk away afterward. It carved the conquered territory into 4 administrative commanderies, and the biggest of them, Lelang, sat almost exactly where Pyongyang stands today, and stayed under direct foreign administration for roughly 400 years. Sit with that for a second. 4 centuries is longer than the United States has existed, and for all of it, a chunk of what's now North Korea was formerly run by an empire headquartered 1,000 kilometers away. It's the first entry in a pattern this peninsula will repeat with uncomfortable regularity. Powerful outside neighbours deciding they'd quite like a say in who runs this particular strip of mountains and rivers. It would not, by a long way, be the last. Write that down. There's a quiz later. Not literally, but you'll notice it again. While Lelang ran its bureaucracy up north, the rest of the peninsula spent the next few centuries as a patchwork. Nobody could quite draw a clean map of historians, just call it the Proto-Three Kingdoms period, which is academic shorthand for it's complicated. Up in the northeast, tribal confederacies like Goryeo, Goguryeo and Jong-il hunted and farmed their way through brutal winters. Down south, 3 looser groupings called Mahan, Jinhan and Bayonhan were doing their own thing, eventually feeding into 2 kingdoms we'll meet properly next chapter. None of these were kingdoms yet in any modern sense, more like extended family businesses with spears. But out of that scattered mess, one confederation on the northern frontier was about to get considerably more ambitious than its neighbours. That confederation became Goguryeo, and because apparently no Korean origin story is complete without one, it comes with its own myth, suspiciously similar in shape to Dangun's. The founder, Jumong, was said to be the son of a heavenly prince and the daughter of a river god, a lineage that got him persecuted by jealous rivals back in the kingdom of Goryeo. So he fled south with a handful of loyal followers, aided along the way, depending which version you hear, by fish and turtles who formed a bridge across a river so his enemies couldn't follow. Divine father, earthly mother with a supernatural streak, a dramatic escape, a kingdom founded out of spite and necessity. Sound familiar? In 37 BCE, Jumong founded Goguryeo. This dynasty, unlike Dangun's, was about to leave a paper trail. And what a paper trail. Goguryeo settled into the same brutal terrain we spent all of last chapter describing: the Kama Plateau, the mountain ranges, winters that could kill you for the crime of being outdoors and terrain. Like that doesn't support gentle farming villages. It supports hunters. It supports people who get extremely good with a bow because missing dinner means starving, and who build their towns as mountain fortresses because the landscape practically hands you the walls for free. Goguryeo absorbed its northern neighbours, Goryeo and Goguryeo and Jong-il, one by one, less through diplomacy and more through the time-honoured strategy of being better armed and considerably more motivated. Within a few centuries, this hunting confederation from the hills had become the single most dangerous kingdom in the region. That danger peaked under a king whose name translates, roughly, to broad expander of domain Goguryeo the Great, who ruled from 391 to 413 CE, and spent almost the entire reign proving the title accurate. By the time he was done, Goguryeo controlled roughly 3/4 of the Korean peninsula plus nearly all of Manchuria, with chunks of what's now Inner Mongolia and Russia thrown in an empire considerably larger, at its height, than most European countries manage today, run out of a fortress capital in the mountains rather than anything resembling a modern city. His son Jiangsu was so proud of the resume, he had it carved into a granite slab standing about 21 feet tall, still visible today near the Yalu River in what's now northeastern China. It remains one of the largest engraved monuments anywhere on Earth, essentially a giant stone billboard reading, in essence, "My dad was extremely good at this," which is one way to handle grief. Jiangsu didn't just commission monuments, he moved the capital. In 427 CE, he relocated the seat of Goguryeo power to a city on the Taedong River called Pyongyang. Yes, that Pyongyang, the same city currently serving as the capital of North Korea, has now been somebody's capital, on and off, for roughly 1600 years, which makes it one of the longest continuously significant cities in East Asia, a detail that tends to get buried under everything that's happened there since. Under Jiangsu, Goguryeo reached the absolute peak of its power, a genuine regional superpower with mountain fortresses, a professional warrior class, and borders that made its neighbours distinctly nervous. Unfortunately, one of those nervous neighbours was about to become the largest, most organised empire China had seen in centuries. That empire was the Sui dynasty, which in 589 CE finally reunified China after roughly 300 years of fragmentation and civil war. Newly unified empires have a predictable personality flaw. Having just proven they can conquer everyone at home, they immediately start wondering who else is available. Goguryeo, sitting right there on the northeastern border with an army and an attitude, was an obvious target. The first attempt, in 598 CE, sent roughly 300,000 Sui troops toward Goguryeo's frontier, and a combination of storms, flooding, disease, and stubborn defense chewed the invasion apart before it achieved much of anything. Humiliated but not remotely deterred, Sui China spent the next decade planning something bigger, considerably bigger. In 612 CE, Emperor Yang of Sui invaded again, this time with over 1 million soldiers, plausibly the largest single army assembled anywhere on Earth to that point in human history. Against it, Goguryeo had one general, Yulji Mundeok, and a plan built on patience rather than muscle. Rather than meet that army head-on, he baited it, staging 7 feigned defeats in a single day at one point, luring an increasingly overconfident enemy deeper into hostile mountains, farther from supply lines, hungrier with every mile. By the time the exhausted, half-starved Sui vanguard reached the Salsu River, Yulji Mundeok had quietly dammed it upstream. As they waded across the shallows, the dam broke, the flood hit, and Goguryeo's cavalry came down on whoever was still standing. Of the roughly 305,000 soldiers who had pushed this deep into Goguryeo territory, only about 2,700 made it back across the border, a casualty rate that still ranks among the worst in pre-modern military history. Yulji Mundeok, not content with merely winning, sent the retreating Sui general a taunting 4-line poem praising his brilliant strategy and gently suggesting he might want to head home now. That poem happens to be the oldest surviving piece of Korean poetry on record, history's first great trash talk, and it was aimed squarely at an emperor's favourite general, on the emperor's own losing battlefield, which is a genuinely remarkable way for a country's written literary tradition to begin, dripping with sarcasm and body count in equal measure. Sui China tried twice more, in 613 and 614, and failed both times, bleeding money and manpower it could not afford to lose. By 618 CE, the dynasty that had reunified all of China less than 30 years earlier collapsed into rebellion and was swept away entirely, replaced by a new house calling itself Tang. Goguryeo had, in a very real sense, broken an empire, but empires have a habit of holding grudges longer than they hold territory, and the Tang dynasty inherited Sui's unfinished business along with its throne. Goguryeo would spend the next several decades as the biggest, toughest kingdom on the peninsula while, in the south, 2 smaller rivals, it had never quite taken seriously enough, were about to make an alliance that would end up rewriting the entire map. Chapter 3. A dangerous alliance, a borrowed name, and 4 centuries behind a locked door. So, 2 smaller kingdoms, a big scary neighbour to the north, and a plan that seemed brilliant right up until it very nearly wasn't. Silla, tucked into the southeast corner of the peninsula, looked at Goguryeo's mountain fortresses and its warrior culture and decided, reasonably, that beating it alone was not going to happen. So Silla's king, Muyel, did what smaller powers have been doing throughout history. Whenever they're outmatched, he called in a bigger friend. That friend was China, the empire that had just finished cleaning up after Sui's spectacular failures next door, and Tang was more than happy to help, for reasons that were about 90% geopolitical opportunism and 10% genuine alliance. In 660 CE, the combined Silla-Tang force turned on Baekje first, Silla's western neighbour, and knocked it flat. 1 down. Goguryeo, the kingdom that had spent the better part of a century humiliating Chinese emperors, took a little longer to finish off 700 years of momentum, doesn't stop on a dime, but by 668 CE, after a coordinated assault from Tang forces crossing the Liao River in the north and the Silla-Tang alliance pressing up from the south, Pyongyang fell. Goguryeo was done. The 3 Kingdoms period, which had run for the better part of 7 centuries, ended not with a single decisive battle, but with the Mountain Kingdom finally running out of mountains to hide behind. Silla had gotten exactly what it wanted, which is usually the moment in these stories where you should start worrying. And sure enough, Tang had not crossed an entire peninsula and burned down 2 kingdoms purely out of neighbourly generosity. The plan, it turned out, was to keep the whole thing administer former Baekje and Goguryeo territory directly, and treat Silla as a junior partner in an empire, not an equal ally in a liberation. Silla had, in effect, hired a bodyguard to beat up the bully, and the bodyguard had decided to just move in. From 671 to 676 CE, Silla fought its former ally in a war that gets criminally little attention, considering it decided who'd actually run Korea. Silla won. Tang pulled its administrative apparatus back to Manchuria, and for the first time, most of the peninsula answered to one native government. Unification, it turns out, is rarely as clean as the word suggests. What followed was genuinely spectacular, and it deserves a moment before we rush past it. From roughly 676 to 765 CE, unified Silla enjoyed something close to a golden age. Peace, prosperity, and a capital at Gyeongju that swelled towards something in the neighbourhood of 1 million people, which put it in the same league as the biggest cities on earth at the time. Buddhism became the state religion, and the kingdom backed it with real money, funding something on the order of 10,000 temples, including Bulguksa and the Seokguram Grotto, still considered among the finest Buddhist art and architecture anywhere in East Asia. They also built Cheomseongdae, a stone observatory that still stands today and is generally regarded as the oldest surviving astronomical observatory in Asia. Not bad for a kingdom that started this chapter as the underdog nobody took seriously. Of course, nothing gold stays that way, especially not in a kingdom that structured its entire aristocracy around something called the bone rank system, a hereditary caste hierarchy so rigid it determined the size of your house, the colour you were allowed to wear, and how high you could ever realistically climb, all based on which ancestors you'd had the good sense to be born to. Systems like that work great right up until the people locked at the bottom stopped finding it charming. By the 9th century, succession disputes were tearing the royal family apart. Provincial strongmen were carving out their own private armies, and peasant uprisings were becoming a regular feature of the news cycle. Silla fractured into what historians call the later Three Kingdoms period. Same old peninsula, a fresh round of warlords fighting over it. Out of that chaos rose a warlord named Goguryeo, who started strong and ended, frankly, unhinged by most accounts. He came to believe he was a living Buddha with the power to read minds, and started executing people, including his own family, for thoughts he claimed to have detected. One of his own generals, a capable and considerably less delusional man named Wang Jian, eventually decided enough was enough and had him overthrown. In 918 CE, Wang Jian founded a new kingdom and named it Goryeo, a deliberately shortened homage to Goguryeo, the old northern empire whose glory he wanted to reclaim. Here's the detail worth sitting with that name. Goryeo is the direct ancestor of the word Korea. Every time you say the country's name in English, you are, in a roundabout way, quoting a 10th century branding decision. Wang Jian spent the next 18 years mopping up the competition, and by 936 CE, Goryeo controlled the whole peninsula. Silla's last king simply handed over his throne rather than fight a losing war. Under Goryeo, Buddhist culture reached genuinely staggering heights of ambition. When the Mongols threatened to burn the kingdom's sacred Buddhist scripture collection, monks responded by carving the entire Tripitaka out of wood, all 81,000 printing blocks of it, essentially betting that spiritual devotion could outbuild an invading army. And here's the detail that tends to blow people's minds when they hear it for the first time in 1377 CE. Goryeo printers produced a book called the Jikji, using movable metal type, making it the oldest known book printed this way anywhere on the planet. That's roughly 78 years before Gutenberg's press in Europe. Korea beat Germany to the printing revolution by 3/4 of a century, and most people have simply never heard about it. Unfortunately, being an innovative, prosperous kingdom in this part of the world tends to attract attention, and in the 13th century, the attention arrived in the form of the single scariest military machine humanity had produced up to that point, the Mongol Empire. Contact turned hostile in 1211, and by 1231, full invasions were underway. Goryeo's response was creative, if a little undignified. The royal court packed up and relocated to Gangwon Island, just off the coast, correctly betting that Mongol cavalry, unbeatable on open plains, had absolutely no idea what to do with a body of water. And here's a genuinely wild footnote. In 1232, a monk named Kim Jong-un managed to kill the Mongol commander Sartai during the fighting at Jong-il. Across the Mongol Empire's entire staggering run of conquests, from Hungary to the Pacific, that is the only recorded instance of a Mongol army commander being killed in battle. One monk, one arrow, one extremely unique line in the history books. That single victory didn't stop the bleeding, though. The Mongols kept coming back, campaign after campaign, for nearly 3 decades, grinding the countryside down, until Goryeo finally submitted in 1259. What followed was roughly 80 years as a Mongol Yuan vassal state. Goryeo kings were required to marry Mongol princesses, essentially becoming permanent in-laws to the empire that had just spent 30 years trying to burn their country down, which is an astonishingly awkward family dynamic even by royal marriage standards. Goryeo was also conscripted, quite literally, into building ships and supplying troops for the Yuan's 2 failed invasions of Japan, which is a bit like being forced to fund your captor's next kidnapping attempt. A last-ditch military faction called the Sambiolcho refused to accept the surrender at all, fighting on from island strongholds until they were finally crushed in 1373. Independence only really returned once the Yuan dynasty itself began collapsing back in China, decades later. Which brings us to a general named Yi Seong-gye, and one of the more audacious career pivots in Korean history. In 1388, the Goryeo court ordered him to march north and invade Ming China, a plan he privately regarded as suicidal. So, at a river crossing called Wiwa Island, instead of continuing north, he turned his entire army around and marched back to the capital instead, deciding that overthrowing his own government was the considerably safer career move. 4 years of consolidation later, in 1392, he founded a new dynasty, Joseon, and shifted the capital to a city called Hanyang, which you now know as Seoul. It's worth pausing on that the reason Seoul is Korea's capital today traces back, in a very direct line, to one general deciding a suicide mission wasn't for him. Joseon's founders didn't just want a new royal family, though they wanted a whole new operating system for society, and they found it in Neo-Confucianism, which they installed as state ideology in place of Buddhism. Overnight, or close to it, Korea reorganized itself around a strict hierarchy of scholar aristocrats called Yangban, a demanding civil service exam system, and an almost obsessive emphasis on ancestor worship and filial duty. One of the dynasty's early kings, Sejong, gets a special mention here in the 1440s. Frustrated that ordinary Koreans couldn't read the complicated Chinese characters used for writing, he had a brand new phonetic alphabet designed specifically to be learnable by a clever person in a matter of days. That alphabet, Hangul, is still in use today, virtually unchanged, which might be the single most successful literacy project in human history. For its first 2 centuries, Joseon mostly got to enjoy its new bureaucratic machine in peace. That ended catastrophically in 1592, when Japan's newly unified ruler, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, decided that conquering Korea was merely step 1 on his way to conquering Ming China, which is the kind of ambition that should have come with a very stiff warning label. On land, the invasion went badly for Korea almost immediately. At sea, it was an entirely different story, largely thanks to one admiral, Yi Sun-sin, and his Kobukson armoured, cannon-studded turtle ships widely considered the world's first ironclad warships. Yi's fleet shredded Japanese convoys up and down the southern coast, sinking dozens of ships in a single week at one point, and by the time the war finally sputtered out in 1598, Korea had survived. Barely. The countryside, though, was ash, and the psychological scar was permanent. If Hideyoshi's invasion planted the seed of Korean wariness toward the outside world, the Manchu invasions finished the job. Twice, in 1627 and again in 1636, Manchu forces swept down from the north and forced Joseon into humiliating submission, eventually as a tributary of the new Qing dynasty in China. Between one devastating invasion from the sea and 2 more from the north, in less than half a century, Joseon had learned a hard lesson about what happens to a small kingdom that keeps its front door too welcoming. So it stopped welcoming anyone. Foreign travel was banned outright. Trade was throttled down to tightly controlled channels through Qing China and through a single narrow contact point, Japan. When a group of shipwrecked Dutch sailors led by Hendrik Hamel washed ashore in the 1650s, Joseon didn't deport them or welcome them, it simply kept them, for 13 years, as a kind of long-term inconvenience nobody quite knew what to do with. That posture hardened for generations, and by the time Western writers got around to describing it, they'd landed on a nickname that stuck permanently: the Hermit Kingdom, popularized by an 1882 book that literally put the phrase in its title. The man who enforced this policy most aggressively was a regent named the Hyungseon Daewongun, ruling in the name of his young son, King Gojong, through the 1860s and early 1870s. He cracked down hard on Catholic missionaries, fortified the coastline, and turned away foreign ships with something bordering on relish. In 1866, an American merchant vessel called the General Sherman sailed up the Taedong River trying to force trade at gunpoint, got itself thoroughly stuck, and was burned by furious locals, with the entire crew killed. France sent a punitive expedition that same year over the missionary crackdown. The Hermit, it's fair to say, was not interested in visitors. The United States tried its own show of force in 1871, landing Marines on Gangwa Island after the General Sherman affair went unresolved, and got repelled soundly enough that Washington simply gave up and sailed home. It was Japan, ironically, that finally cracked the shell, the same nation that had itself been forced open by American gunboats a couple of decades earlier, turned around and ran precisely the same playbook. In 1875, a Japanese warship called the Unyo provoked an exchange of fire at, of course, Gangwa Island, and used it as justification to demand a treaty at gunpoint. Korea signed the following year, in 1876, cracking open its ports to Japanese trade for the first time in generations. The Hermit's door hadn't fully opened yet, but the lock had just been picked, and the country standing on the doorstep, smiling and newly modernized, had considerably bigger ambitions than trade. Chapter 4. Under the Rising Sun. Fast forward almost 2 decades from that first cracked open port, and Korea is still standing technically, still a kingdom, still ruled by the Joseon dynasty, but nominally is doing a lot of work in that sentence. By the early 1890s, Korea's government is broke, corrupt, and squeezed on every side by foreign powers suddenly fascinated by it. Then, in the spring of 1894, the pressure valve blows. In the southwest, peasants rise up under a preacher-turned-rebel leader named John Bong-joon, furious about crushing taxes and a local official who'd treated corruption as a competitive sport. They call themselves the Donghak Eastern Learning, a homegrown religious movement preaching that all people were equal. In a rigid class society built on the opposite idea, that's basically a declaration of war on the management. The rebellion spread fast, and King Gojoseon panicked. Rather than negotiate with his own furious citizens, he called in a bigger friend, asking China's Qing dynasty for troops which China happily provided, having treated Korea like a slightly rebellious nephew for centuries. Japan, watching with the patience of a cat at a mouse hole, decided this was the perfect excuse to send in its own troops too uninvited, in numbers nobody had asked for. Within weeks, Japanese forces had occupied Seoul, installed a puppet government, and made clear to both the Korean court and the Qing dynasty that the old rules no longer applied. The peasant rebellion that started this whole mess got crushed by autumn, its poorly armed farmers mowed down, storming entrenched positions. The war it triggered was just getting started. That war, the First Sino-Japanese War, was a huge anticlimax. If you were rooting for China, everyone assumed the ancient, enormous Qing Empire would flatten the upstart island nation that had only finished modernizing about 20 minutes earlier, historically speaking. Instead, Japan won almost every battle, on land and at sea, in under a year. By the treaty that ended it, signed at Shimonoseki in the spring of 1895, China was forced to formally recognize Korea's independence. Read that word carefully, it's doing something sneaky. It didn't mean Korea got to run its own affairs. It meant China had to stop claiming Korea, so Japan could start claiming it instead. China also handed over Taiwan, a chunk of Manchuria, and a crippling indemnity. The message was unmistakable. There was a new heavyweight in East Asia, and it wasn't wearing a Qing dynasty robe. Into the power vacuum stepped Empress Myeongsong Queen Min, as she's more commonly known, one of the sharpest political minds the Korean court had produced in generations. With her husband's authority crumbling, she quietly courted Russia as a counterweight, betting correctly that Japan's overreach had spooked the other great powers. It worked well enough to genuinely alarm Tokyo. Japan's response was not diplomatic. In the early hours of October the 8th, 1895, Japanese-backed soldiers and hired assassins stormed the royal palace in Seoul. What happened next is one of the darkest single episodes in Korea's history. The Queen was hunted down inside her own residence, dragged outside, and killed with swords in front of witnesses. Her body was then burned. The men responsible were operatives acting with the direct approval of Japan's own minister to Korea. This isn't legend, it's documented, and it happened to the sitting empress of a nation Japan wasn't yet even officially at war with. Gojong, understandably, decided his own palace was no longer safe to sleep in. For over a year, he ruled Korea from exile inside the Russian legation in Seoul, a monarch governing his country from a foreign embassy a few streets from the throne room, where his wife had just been murdered. When he finally returned, he tried to reclaim some dignity by declaring Korea an empire in 1897, crowning himself emperor instead of king. A proud gesture. It also fooled nobody. Korea could rename itself whatever it liked. The actual balance of power was still decided by Japan, Russia, and China, in rooms it wasn't invited into, and Japan and Russia were about to settle their disagreement the old-fashioned way. That disagreement became the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, fought mostly over who dominated Manchuria and Korea, largely on Korean and Manchurian soil. With barely a Korean soldier involved in the outcome, Japan won decisively, becoming the first Asian power in the modern era to defeat a major European one, a genuine geopolitical earthquake. The peace treaty was brokered by US President Theodore Roosevelt at a naval shipyard in New Hampshire, an achievement that won him the Nobel Peace Prize, a fairly ironic prize, given the deal's central outcome was Russia formally recognizing Japan's special interests in Korea, diplomatic code for do whatever you want with it. The United States, it turned out, had secretly agreed that same year to recognize Japanese control of Korea in exchange for Japan leaving its own colony in the Philippines alone. Everybody had a price. Korea's was never even asked. 2 months later, Japan moved to make the new arrangement official. In November of 1905, the statesman Ito Hirobumi arrived at the Korean Imperial Palace with a draft treaty and, more persuasively, Japanese troops surrounding the building. Emperor Gojong refused to sign it, so Ito went around him, pressuring the Korean cabinet directly, with the implication that refusal might cost them their safety. 5 ministers eventually signed remembered, unkindly but accurately, as the 5 Ulster traitors. The treaty stripped Korea of control over its foreign affairs and trade, making it a Japanese protectorate in everything but name. Ito installed himself as resident general, the first of several Japanese officials who'd run Korea's affairs for decades to come, and Korea's emperor was now, functionally, a figurehead presiding over a country that could no longer speak for itself. Gojong made one last attempt to fight back through diplomacy instead of force. In 1907, he secretly sent envoys to the International Peace Conference at The Hague, hoping to expose the treaty as the coercion it was. They were denied entry, nobody there particularly wanted to hear it. When Japan found out, it was furious, and it forced Gojong to abdicate in favour of his son, Sunjong, as punishment for appealing to the outside world. A small, quiet humiliation compared to what was coming, but the trajectory was now unmistakable. Korea wasn't being asked to cooperate with its own erosion anymore, it was simply being informed of it. The formality arrived 3 years later. On August the 22nd, 1910, Korea's Prime Minister, Ye Wan-yong, signed a treaty with Japan's resident general formally and permanently ceding Korean sovereignty to the Japanese emperor, proclaimed a week later on August the 29th. And with that, Korea, a nation with roughly 13 unbroken centuries of statehood behind it, simply stopped existing as a country. Not conquered by tanks rolling through the streets, erased through paperwork, at gunpoint, by men who'd spent 15 years leaving no other option on the table. Japan installed a governor-general to rule Korea directly from Seoul, backed by police, soldiers, and an administrative machine built for one purpose: making Korea Japanese permanently. The occupation that followed would last 35 years. The economic side of colonization ran on a simple playbook. Japan conducted a sweeping land survey, ostensibly to modernize property records. In practice, any farmer who couldn't produce exactly the right paperwork and plenty of Korean families working land their ancestors had farmed for generations under informal arrangements simply couldn't lost that land outright, reassigned to Japanese settlers and companies. Korean rice production actually increased under Japanese management. Unfortunately, most of that rice got shipped straight to Japan, while Korean per capita consumption fell. Picture it: farmers growing more food than ever and eating less of it because the surplus was leaving on ships bound somewhere else. Then came the slower, more intimate erasure, the attempt to dismantle Korean identity itself. Japanese was pushed as the national language, with Korean gradually squeezed out of schools. By 1938, Korean language textbooks were banned outright, and by 1942, a directive required all public discourse to be conducted in Japanese, with legal penalties for anyone caught speaking their own mother tongue. Starting in 1939, a policy called Sui China pressured Koreans to trade their family names for Japanese ones, officially voluntary. Unofficially, refusing meant losing access to jobs, schools, and government services, and under that kind of voluntary pressure, somewhere around 80% of Koreans complied within a couple of years. Imagine being free to keep your own name right up until that freedom costs you your job. Resentment like that doesn't stay quiet forever, and in 1919 it erupted. The spark was the death of former Emperor Gojoseon that January, under circumstances many Koreans immediately suspected weren't natural. Using his funeral as cover, 33 Korean religious and cultural leaders drafted a formal declaration of independence and organized peaceful demonstrations to coincide with the mourning crowds gathering in Seoul. On March the 1st, 1919, it began, and it did not stay small. Over the following months, roughly 2 million Koreans took part in more than 1,500 demonstrations nationwide, a spontaneous act of civil defiance against an occupying power with a standing army. For a moment, it must have felt like the whole country exhaled at once. It would not stay peaceful for long. Japan's response arrived quickly, and it was not restrained. By the time Japanese police and soldiers finished suppressing the movement, roughly 7,000 Koreans were dead, 16,000 wounded, and 46,000 arrested. The single most notorious atrocity happened in the village of Jamri that April, when Japanese soldiers herded villagers into a church, locked the doors, and burned it to the ground with everyone still inside. Hundreds of homes and dozens of churches were destroyed in the reprisals that followed nationwide. The movement never achieved its stated goal. Korea did not become independent that year, or for another 26 after it. But it proved undeniably that Japanese rule was not accepted, not welcomed, and not going to be endured quietly. It led directly to a Korean provisional government in exile in Shanghai, keeping the idea of an independent Korea alive. Stung by the uprising's scale, Japan traded outright brutality for something it called cultural rule. a softer public face and cosmetic reforms, while the underlying machinery of assimilation kept running beneath it. But Japan was also building something in Korea that would echo for the rest of the century. Drawn by the hydroelectric potential of the northern rivers, Japan poured investment into the north, building the Supung Dam on the Yalu River, one of the largest hydroelectric facilities in the world at the time, alongside steel mills, chemical plants, and heavy manufacturing complexes. By the war's end, colonial Korea's industrial output accounted for roughly a quarter of Japan's entire industrial base, and almost all of the heaviest of it sat in the north. Remember that. It's going to matter enormously, and soon. As Japan's war effort escalated through the 1930s and into the Second World War, Korea became a labor reservoir to be drained on demand. Through increasingly coercive mobilization programs, recruitment giving way to official mediation, then outright conscription, an estimated 5.4 million Korean civilians were pulled from their homes to support Japan's war machine. Roughly 700 to 800,000 were shipped to Japan itself, many into coal mines under brutal conditions, for little pay and no path home before the war ended. Within Korea, thousands more forced labor sites operated in mines, factories, and military construction projects. Some of these men boys, in plenty of cases, never made it back. They were simply labor, extracted. And there is one more atrocity from this period that has to be named plainly, without softening it. Beginning in the 1930s and continuing through the war's end, the Japanese military operated a system of sexual slavery, euphemistically termed comfort stations, staffed by women and girls recruited through deception, coercion, and outright abduction, the overwhelming majority of them Korean. Historians' estimates of the total number of victims vary enormously, from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands, in part because records were destroyed and many survivors never spoke of what happened to them. What isn't disputed is the scale of the suffering. A large majority of these women did not survive the war. This is not a footnote to the occupation. It is one of its central defining cruelties, and it deserves to be remembered as exactly that. Then, in August of 1945, it simply ended. Japan surrendered to the Allies on August the 15th, and for Koreans, that date became Liberation Day, the sudden, dizzying end of 35 years under a foreign flag. But liberation didn't mean Korea got to decide what came next. Soviet troops were already pushing into Manchuria and northern Korea. American forces were still hundreds of miles away. So, working fast and with startling casualness, two American colonels sat down with a wall map, reportedly just a National Geographic one, and picked a line to divide the peninsula for accepting Japan's surrender. They chose the 38th parallel because it ran roughly through the middle, not because it meant anything to the people who lived there. It was supposed to be temporary. No Korean was in the room when it was drawn. Within days, a nation that had just gotten its country back discovered it wasn't getting all of it. Chapter 5. Brother Against Brother. North of that line, the Soviets moved fast, and unlike the Americans, who were still working out where Korea actually was, Moscow already had a plan. The Soviet 25th Army crossed into Korea before Japan had even finished signing surrender paperwork, and by the time American troops showed up in the south in early September, the north was already under new management. Soviet soldiers requisitioned buildings, arrested Japanese officials, and started looking around for someone local to run the place. Not elect. Look around for. That distinction matters, because the man they eventually settled on wasn't chosen so much as auditioned, and the audition process was, to put it gently, unconventional. His name was Kim Song-ju, and if you'd asked anyone in Korea who that was in the summer of 1945, you'd have gotten a shrug. He was 33, a former mid-level guerrilla commander who'd spent most of the previous decade fighting the Japanese in Manchuria under the Chinese communists, which is genuinely impressive on its own. Then, in the early 1940s, with Japanese forces closing in, he fled into the Soviet Union, where the Red Army did what large militaries do with promising foreign fighters, put him in a uniform, gave him a desk, and mostly forgot about him. For 3 years, the future ruler of North Korea was a captain in a Soviet infantry brigade, filing paperwork in the Russian Far East. It's one of the least dramatic origin stories of any 20th century dictator, which is exactly why Pyongyang never tells it that way. So Moscow rebranded him. In September of 1945, he sailed back into Korea aboard a Soviet ship, and on October 14th, Soviet General Ivan Chistyakov introduced him to a Pyongyang crowd as Kim Il-sung, the legendary partisan hero who'd spent years leading a guerrilla army against the Japanese from a secret base on Mount Paektu. According to every surviving Soviet and Chinese record, there was no secret base and no guerrilla army. The genuinely heroic exploits being described belonged, at least in part, to other Korean fighters who also happened to be named Kim, a startlingly common name whose real owners, legends, Kim Il-sung's biographers, would spend the next several decades quietly folding into one composite myth. It's essentially the century's most successful case of identity theft, except the victim was a folk hero and the thief became head of state. The crowd that day was reportedly underwhelmed. They'd expected a battle-hardened veteran in his 50s, weathered by years in the mountains, and got instead a baby-faced 33-year-old in an ill-fitting suit who looked more like a mid-level Soviet bureaucrat than a folk legend, because that's exactly what he was. It didn't matter. Moscow needed a loyal, malleable administrator, and Kim had 2 qualities more useful than charisma: fluent Russian and a career built entirely on Soviet patronage. Over the next 2 years, occupation authorities quietly sidelined his rivals in the Korean Communist movement and built the propaganda apparatus around him piece by piece, which is a very dry way of saying they manufactured a cult of personality from scratch in real time with all the enthusiasm of a startup launching a rebrand. Down south, the Americans were running their own version of this, minus the guerrilla mythology. Their pick was Syngman Rhee, a 70-year-old independence activist who'd spent most of the previous 4 decades in the United States, held a doctorate from Princeton, and had campaigned for Korean independence from exile so long that almost nobody in Korea actually knew him personally. Washington liked him for one overriding reason. He was uncompromisingly anti-communist, which in 1946 was close to the only qualification that mattered. He was also autocratic and thin-skinned, traits that would define South Korean politics for the next decade. A debatably fair election in July of 1948 made him president. By the middle of that year, Korea had 2 new leaders, installed by 2 different foreign militaries, each insisting he alone represented the entire peninsula. On August 15th, 1948, exactly 3 years after Japan's surrender, the Republic of Korea was declared in Seoul. Not to be outdone, the North waited 3 weeks and declared the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on September 9th, with Kim Il-sung as premier. Both governments wrote constitutions claiming the whole peninsula. Both printed maps showing the other half as occupied territory awaiting liberation. Both considered the 38th parallel a temporary insult rather than a real border, which, to be fair to both of them, is exactly what it was supposed to be. The one thing Pyongyang and Seoul agreed on completely was that this arrangement couldn't last. They just had wildly different ideas about who would end it and how. Through 1949, The border was less a boundary and more an open wound, with artillery exchanges and cross-border raids that killed thousands of soldiers before either side had officially declared a war. Kim spent that year in Moscow, repeatedly asking Stalin for permission and weapons to finish the job by force. Stalin said no. Then, in the spring of 1950, after North Korea gained a decisive edge in Soviet tanks and aircraft, after China's civil war ended in a communist victory next door, and after a US official gave a speech that seemed to draw America's Pacific defensive line in a way that conveniently left Korea outside it, Stalin changed his mind. He gave Kim a green light on one condition: if things went badly, the Soviet Union wasn't coming to the rescue. Kim, supremely confident, didn't plan for things going badly. They went badly almost immediately, just not for the side you'd expect at first. At dawn on June 25th, 1950, roughly 90,000 North Korean troops, backed by Soviet-built tanks the South had no real answer for, poured across the parallel in a coordinated surprise attack. Seoul fell in 3 days. The South Korean army, deliberately kept small and underarmed by Washington, which feared Ri would use heavy weapons to invade the North himself, more or less disintegrated. Within weeks, North Korean forces had pushed what remained of the defenders and their scrambling American reinforcements into a shrinking pocket around the port city of Pusan in the peninsula's extreme southeastern corner. By August, the entire war for Korea's future had been compressed into a defensive line barely larger than a couple of counties, and it looked, quite plausibly, already lost. It wasn't. On September 15th, General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the United Nations force assembled under a Security Council resolution the Soviets happened to be boycotting that month, launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port near Seoul with tides and mudflats so brutal that nearly every officer he consulted called the plan insane. He did it anyway. 80,000 troops hit the beaches, cut clean through the North Korean rear, and within 2 weeks Seoul was recaptured, and the entire North Korean invasion force, still tangled up around Pusan, found its supply lines severed. It remains one of the boldest reversals in modern military history, and it turned a war that had looked functionally lost into one that suddenly looked, for the UN coalition, disturbingly winnable. MacArthur didn't stop at the 38th parallel. With Truman's blessing, UN forces pushed north all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China, while MacArthur publicly promised troops would be home by Christmas. China, having just finished its own civil war, viewed a hostile American-backed army camped on its border as somewhere between a threat and an insult, and warned Washington repeatedly through back channels that it would intervene if the advance continued. MacArthur, convinced China was bluffing, ignored the warnings. This is the part of the story where you're allowed to feel the dread building. Because if there's one lesson great powers keep failing to learn, it's that dismissing a warning from a country that just fought a brutal civil war is rarely the wise move. China was not bluffing. In late November of 1950, somewhere between 130,000 and 300,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu, catching overextended UN forces almost completely by surprise, in cold enough to freeze rifle bolts shut. What followed was one of the longest retreats in American military history, a brutal fighting withdrawal through mountain passes that survivors still describe as the worst experience of their lives. Seoul, recaptured with such fanfare 2 months earlier, changed hands again. By spring of 1951, after roughly a year of the war's most dramatic seesaw campaign, the front had settled back into almost the same place it started, near the 38th parallel. All that combined offensive and counteroffensive, hundreds of thousands of casualties, for a net change in territory measurable in single-digit miles. And then, almost unbelievably, the war continued for 2 more years. Not the sweeping, mobile war of 1950, but a grinding, entrenched, hill-by-hill stalemate with more in common with the trenches of the First World War than with the campaign that had opened it. Armies dug in along a line that barely moved, dying over ridgelines with names like Porkchop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge, while negotiators argued for months in the village of Panmunjom over a ceasefire both sides had. In practice, already accepted was inevitable. It's one of history's more grimly efficient demonstrations of the gap between when a war becomes pointless and when the people fighting it are actually allowed to stop. While the ground war stalled, the air war didn't. American bombers dropped roughly 635,000 tons of bombs on Korea over the course of the conflict, more than the entire Pacific theater of the Second World War, including tens of thousands of tons of napalm. Most of it fell on the north. By the summer of 1953, Sinanju had been effectively wiped off the map. Sariwon was 95% destroyed. Hungnam, 85%. Wonsan and Hamhung, 80% each. And Pyongyang, the capital, roughly 75%. Survivors described entire districts where, once the bombing stopped, only 2 or 3 structures were still standing. When American planners eventually ran short of urban targets, they began bombing irrigation dams instead, deliberately flooding farmland to destroy the coming harvest. The human toll is almost impossible to hold in your head all at once. Estimates for total Korean War deaths across the peninsula run from 2 to 3 million people, most of them civilians, and North Korea's own post-war records show its population falling by close to 2 million between 1948 and 1953, a drop of roughly 1/5 in 5 years. Curtis LeMay, the American general who'd helped plan the firebombing of Japanese cities in the previous war and went on to oversee much of this one, later estimated the campaign had killed around 20% of North Korea's entire population. Every North Korean born after the war grew up in a country that had, quite literally, been leveled, and that fact would shape everything the regime told its people about the outside world for the next 70 years. The fighting finally stopped on July 27, 1953, when military commanders from North Korea, China, and the United Nations Command signed the Korean Armistice Agreement at Panmunjom. Syngman Rhee refused to put his name on it, still furious the war was ending without a unified non-communist Korea. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people. It was never a peace treaty. By its own wording, it was a ceasefire meant to hold only until a final peaceful settlement could be reached. A follow-up peace conference in Geneva the next year collapsed without producing one. That's the reason the demilitarized zone from Chapter 1 still exists, still bristling with landmines and troops on both sides, and it's also the reason that, more than 70 years later, North and South Korea remain, on paper, still officially at war. Kim Il-sung wasted no time turning the devastation to his political advantage. He needed someone to blame for a war that had killed 1/5 of his own population and ended in a bloody draw, and the domestic faction, communists who'd stayed and organized inside Korea during the Japanese occupation, rather than fleeing to Moscow or China, made a convenient target, since they alone had no foreign patron to protect them. Their leader, Pak Hon-yong, once the most senior communist inside Korea itself, was arrested, accused of espionage for the United States, and executed in 1955 after a show trial that fooled almost nobody. Kim followed up in 1956 by crushing an attempted challenge from the Soviet and Yan'an factions, purging or exiling nearly every senior communist in the country who hadn't fought alongside him personally in Manchuria. What was left by the end of the 1950s, was a country run by one man who owed his position to a myth the Soviets had built for him, a population traumatized by a war that had erased their cities, and an ideology quietly taking shape to explain it all. Juche, the doctrine of self-reliance which conveniently reframed North Korea's total dependence on Soviet and Chinese support as proud, defiant independence. Kim had eliminated every rival faction with a foreign sponsor. He had a population with nowhere else to turn and nothing else to believe. And he was just getting started, because the personality cult that began as Soviet stagecraft in a Pyongyang square in 1945 was about to become something no propaganda office in Moscow had ever intended or could have controlled. Chapter 6. The Kingdom of the Kims. So here's the thing about Juche. On paper, it was supposed to be Marxism-Leninism with a Korean accent, Kim Il-sung's local remix of the ideology his Soviet sponsors had installed him to run. In practice, it turned into something no import from Moscow could account for. The word itself just means self-reliance, and by the mid-1950s, Kim was leaning on it constantly, though it took another decade to harden into an actual system with rules. 4 pillars, officially: self-reliance in ideology, independence in politics, self-sufficiency in the economy, self-defense in the military. Say those back-to-back at a dinner party, and you'll sound like a fortune cookie that's had one espresso too many. But strip away the slogans and the message underneath was simpler, and a lot more useful if you happen to be running the country. The outside world is dangerous. Nobody is coming to help you, and there is exactly one family qualified to keep you safe from it. By the time Kim Jong-il got his hands on the ideology, he'd polished it into something closer to a state religion than an economic policy, a strange direction for a doctrine literally named after self-sufficiency to travel in. Juche stopped being an argument you could win or lose and became a kind of scripture, something you were simply supposed to believe, the way you believe gravity or your own name. Schoolchildren memorized it. Workplaces held study sessions on it, and underneath the philosophy classes sat one consistent, unphilosophical function. It manufactured isolation, then sold that isolation back to people as protection. Cut a country off from the world for long enough, and self-reliance stops being a choice. It becomes the only story left standing. And the state didn't just want you to believe the ideology, it wanted you to see it, constantly, everywhere you looked. 1972. Kim Il-sung's 60th birthday. The regime unveiled 2 bronze statues on Mansu Hill in Pyongyang, each standing something like 70 feet tall. Kim towering over the city he'd built his myth in. Visitors are required to bow. Photographs must include the entire monument, or the crop itself is treated as an insult. That same year, portrait badges became mandatory for every adult. Small lapel pins with Kim's face on them, over 20 designs in circulation, and here's the detail that tells you everything about how this society works. The double portrait pins, with both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, weren't for everyone. Those were reserved for the elite. Your face jewellery had a class system too. Remember that suspicious birth story from the geography chapter? Kim Jong-il supposedly arriving on Paektu's slopes under a double rainbow while a new star appeared overhead, when the actual paperwork puts him in a Soviet army camp in Siberia. That wasn't a one-off flourish. That was the opening move in a bigger project, one the regime kept building on for decades, stitching all 3 generations of Kims into a single unbroken bloodline running back to the sacred mountain itself. The Paektu bloodline, as it's officially called, as though political legitimacy was something you could inherit the way you inherit eye colour. It's genealogy repurposed as branding, and it never really stops. Every leader since has needed his own dose of that volcanic mythology, because in a country where you don't get to vote for your government, you'd better have a convincing story about why you didn't need to. Underneath the statues and pins and mountain myths, though, sat something far less theatrical and far more consequential for daily life, a system called songbun. Developed between roughly 1957 and 1960, as Kim Il-sung finished consolidating power, songbun sorted the population into around 51 categories, grouped under three broad classes: core, wavering, and hostile. Your placement depended not on anything you did, but on what your father and grandfather did, specifically how loyally your family behaved during the Japanese occupation and the Korean War, decades before you were born. This status followed you for life, and your children after you. It decided where you could live, what job you could hold, who you could marry, and in leaner years, how much food showed up on your plate. Imagine a filing cabinet holding your family's permanent record, except it started before you existed and you can never clear it. Out on the international stage, Kim Il-sung spent the Cold War performing a much subtler trick, arguably the single most impressive thing he ever pulled off. Wedged between the Soviet Union and China, two communist giants who increasingly couldn't stand each other, Kim didn't have to pick a side. He could play them off one another, lean toward Beijing when Moscow got difficult, lean back toward Moscow when Beijing got difficult, and collect aid and cover from both the entire time. It wasn't always smooth. Chinese Red Guards spent part of the Cultural Revolution mocking him for fence-sitting, and he'd already crushed the pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions in his own party back in the mid-50s. The same purges from the last chapter. But the act worked for decades, right up until one of the two patrons stopped existing. That happened in December of 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it went the subsidized oil, discounted trade, and aid that had quietly kept North Korea's math working for 40 years. Self-reliance had always been the marketing slogan. Now, for the first time, it was actually being tested against an economy that had never once been built to survive alone. Factories that needed Soviet parts stopped running. Farms that needed Soviet fuel and fertilizer stopped producing at anything like the scale the country needed. The centrally planned system had no flexibility built into it anywhere, no shock absorbers, and when the shock came, there was nothing underneath to catch the fall. Add in catastrophic flooding in 1995 and drought the following years, and the state's food distribution system, the thing tens of millions depended on for every meal, began to break down completely. What followed, the state itself named the Arduous March, and no amount of narration distance makes that period easier to sit with. Estimates of the dead vary wildly, from roughly 240,000 up past 1 million, commonly cited around 5% of the population, gone in roughly 4 years. Try to hold that for a second. Not a statistic. A father rationing a single bowl of corn broth across 4 family members and watching it not be enough. Children called kotjebi, flower swallows, turned loose onto train platforms and market streets because there was no food left at home, surviving on grass, soup and bark and whatever they could scavenge or steal. Refugees later described eating rats, eating pets, and in the worst documented cases, cannibalism. This wasn't a natural disaster the country simply endured. It was an ideology's design flaws, arriving all at once, on people who never got a vote in any of it. Kim Il-sung didn't live to see the worst of it. He died of a heart attack on July 8, 1994, just as the crisis was beginning to take hold, and the state responded with a mourning spectacle on a scale the country had never staged before. Over 1 million people reportedly filing past the funeral procession in Pyongyang. His embalmed body still lies on permanent display at the Kumsusan Palace of the Sunday. And here's the detail that outdoes almost anything else in this story for sheer audacity. In 1998, 4 years after he died, North Korea's constitution was amended to name Kim Il-sung eternal president and retire the office entirely, so no living person could ever hold it again. He is, to this day, officially still the head of state. A corpse, constitutionally outranking everyone currently breathing in the country he founded. Power passed to his son, Kim Jong-il, who made one calculated choice right at the start. He never touched the presidency. That title belonged to his dead father forever, so Kim Jong-il ruled instead through the Workers' Party, and increasingly, the military, formalizing a doctrine called Songun, military-first politics. In January of 1995, the army got fed first, funded first, promoted first, ahead of a starving population in exchange for total loyalty and, more practically, for functioning as the last institution that could still keep basic order while everything else fell apart. Survival strategy dressed up as ideology, which by now should sound familiar. And while his own people buried relatives and boiled grass for soup, Kim Jong-il poured what resources remained toward a different kind of insurance policy: nuclear weapons. The nuclear timeline moves in fits and starts across the following decade. A Taepodong-1 missile arced clean over Japan in August of 1998, which tends to get a country's neighbours paying close attention. North Korea walked out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003, and in October of 2006, the state announced its first successful nuclear test, joining an exclusive club it had spent roughly 2 decades trying to buy its way into. Diplomacy flickered on and off around it. 6-party talks, promises to disable facilities for aid, promises that mostly didn't hold. By the time Kim Jong-il's health began visibly failing in the late 2000s, North Korea had achieved the one thing that had eluded every version of this state since its founding: a guarantee, however grim, that nobody was invading it and getting away clean. Kim Jong-il died on a train on December 17, 2011, of a heart attack much like his father's. State television sat on the news for 2 days before a visibly weeping anchorwoman, dressed in black, announced it to the country. And almost instantly, the machinery of succession snapped into place around his third son, a man in his late 20s who'd been publicly groomed for the role for barely 3 years. Kim Jong-un was declared the great successor before most of the country had processed that the old one was gone. He inherited an economy still limping out of famine, a nuclear program with real momentum, and a family mythology that now needed a fresh coat of paint for its third owner in 3 generations. He also inherited, from his father, one uncle about to become a very serious problem. That uncle was Jang Song-thaek, married to Kim Jong-il's sister, widely considered the second most powerful man in the country and the figure many assumed would help steady the young, untested Kim Jong-un. In December of 2013, he was instead expelled from the party, tried by military tribunal, and executed within days, officially for factionalism and corruption, with state media calling him, in an unusually public statement, worse than a dog. It was a message to every official who'd been quietly wondering whether the new Kim was really in charge. He was. 4 years later, the message got darker still, when Kim Jong-un's own estranged half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was killed at Kuala Lumpur's airport by 2 women who smeared VX nerve agent across his face, apparently believing they were filming a prank for a hidden camera show. He was dead within 20 minutes. 4 North Korean suspects were on flights home before the airport finished processing the scene. Against that backdrop, the missile tests kept climbing, culminating in an especially tense stretch across 2016 and 2017. Intercontinental range missiles the regime claimed could reach the American mainland, and a sixth nuclear test the state described as a hydrogen bomb, which made the sudden pivot to diplomacy in 2018 all the more startling. Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump shook hands in Singapore that June, the first meeting ever between a sitting American president and a North Korean leader, long on handshakes, short on verification. The follow-up summit in Hanoi that February collapsed within hours, lunch cancelled, signing ceremony scrapped, both sides walking away over how much sanctions relief a partial rollback was worth. A photo op at the DMZ that June briefly revived the theatre. Nothing lasting came of it. Which brings us, more or less, to now. North Korea remains nuclear-armed, heavily sanctioned, and about as sealed off from outside information as any country manages to be. Songbun still quietly sorts who eats well and who doesn't. Markets the state never officially approved of, the Jangmadang, have become how ordinary households actually survive, a shadow economy filling gaps the planned one left behind. Defectors describe a widening gap between a curated Pyongyang, complete with new beach resorts for the connected few, and a countryside that never fully recovered from the 90s. Even senior officials who've escaped describe a system where no free life is guaranteed to anyone, elite included. It is a country that has now outlasted the empire that invented it, the war that divided it, and 3 of its own founders, still running on the same 4 words it started with. So maybe that's where we leave it. Somewhere along the demilitarized zone, in that strip of accidental wilderness we talked about back at the very start, cranes still nest every winter in a border nobody meant to turn into a nature reserve, entirely indifferent to which side of the line they're standing on. It's a strange thing to picture, if you let yourself sit with it, this narrow stretch of the world where the birds have more freedom of movement than the 70-some million people it divides. There's no lesson to force out of that image, and I'm not going to try. It's just there, quiet and unresolved, the way the whole story has been from the start, and probably will be for a while yet. Sleep well.